Good evening and welcome to the latest episode of the Pandemic Podcast with me, Dan Astin-Gregory. In tonight's episode, I asked the question, is the tide turning? Are we beginning to see the back of the hysteria around COVID-19 and all of the restrictions, measures and mandates that coincide with this particular situation? Is the tide turning? Well, this will inevitably take the form of a relatively significant rant, but I'll answer the question briefly with yes and no. Firstly, because if you haven't noticed, over the recent weeks, the conversation has turned from the hysteria of the Omicron variant that we saw over the festive period going into Christmas and into the new year to now, in the UK at least, the conversation around how we can now live with the virus. Now, we've had this conversation several times over the course of the last couple of years, but we always end up finding our way back into hysteria, more restrictions and madness. So is the tide turning? Well, it does seem so, at least in part. Now, what we have begun to witness across the media sphere, if we can call it that, is some actual recognition of the core issues that some of us have been banging on about for nearly 2 years now. In fact, I've lost track of how many episodes we've done because we got deplatformed from YouTube, which was a nice way to keep count of how many episodes we've done. But I estimate between 400 and 500 episodes of the Pandemic Podcast in the last 2 years, evaluating these issues, where we've talked about everything around from the flaws of the testing protocol, the case definition, the evidence around the restrictions and mandates, or the lack of evidence, the lack of cost-benefit analysis, the lack of focus on the collateral harms and the long-term damage that's being created from everything that's been occurring. And finally, 2 years on, almost whimsically, the media is now starting to talk about some of these things. I saw an article just the other day which talked about how we shouldn't be using PCR testing at the end of an isolation period because the PCR test can pick up fragments of the virus for 90 days or even longer. So, of course, I mean, this was one of the simplest points that we raised very, very early on about the flaws, one of the many flaws of using a PCR test as a mode of diagnosis. I could go on. There's a profound list, but more frankly, some of the other elements that are coming across in the media now is this idea of it. They have a label. I mean, this is where we may have failed. We didn't give it a label. We were just speaking in terms of common sense, expecting that would be enough. We didn't give it a fancy title. We didn't talk about incidental hospitalizations, which is the term that we use where someone is, or we now use the term we now use, where someone is hospitalized having tested positive in the last 28 days. I mean, 28 days, for goodness sake. The last 28 days and is included in the hospitalization figures. So now we're seeing this coming to light, and the newspapers using their minds. It's almost like there's the spell is beginning to break, so people can start thinking for themselves again and seeing clearly and asking really rational questions. At least that's what you would think. But these small individual press releases, these little stories, these articles that come across across the social media sphere that are shared across us, all of those, we joyously share these articles saying, yes, I mean, we don't, we're bigger than those out there that created all this hysteria. So we don't get on the "I told you so" route, but we're just like we have a knowing nod. We're like, yep. Because the facts will eventually come out, the truth will prevail. And I've been reflecting on this myself in the last few days as I continue to look at the kind of sense-making plan for the Pandemic Podcast and what the podcast will become going forward, because there is so much now that to furthermore answer the piece around is the tide turning. There are so many more people now starting to recognize that it doesn't make sense. Now, for whatever reason, there's always the old story that, everyone's on their own path and that they will come to a point of understanding and wisdom in their own course. 2 years later, people are starting to finally come around and realize, hang on, this doesn't make sense. I saw a comment the other day. Someone was saying, do you remember back in the lockdown when we would argue about whether I could go out for a run, having a half an hour run if I've already been for a half an hour walk that day? This is the absurdity that our minds went through. Well, I say our minds, the collective mind of the people. My mind certainly didn't do that. But nonetheless, that this is the priming that people went throughout this entire period, that led people to this kind of absurd understanding of the situation. I mean, of course, it makes no difference. You could spend 10 hours outside. If you don't have the virus and don't come into contact with someone who's got the virus, it doesn't make a blind bit of difference. But none of these the factual things have counted through the majority of this thing. But nonetheless, many more people are now starting to wake up, if you will. I don't really like that phrase, but it's people are starting to smell the fresh air and smell the roses and recognize that things that have gone before us weren't quite right, and this is happening at scale and quite rapidly, to be quite frank, which puts enormous pressure on the narrative, because the narrative begins to dissolve very quickly when you've got media and the public and influencers and well-known people starting to speak publicly about these issues. Many people have just been afraid, they've been sat at home thinking, I can't say anything about this because people have died. Well, that's very true, but at the same time, if there is atrocities occurring that could be prevented, I always say, if I see someone crossing the road and there's a car coming at 100 miles an hour, it'd be remiss of me to not even pull them back. I might look stupid if I misread the situation and the car was actually going much slower. I may have saved their life. I may have made myself look stupid. But either way, I've taken action in the face of a potential risk. Of a hazard. So with all of this, we've seen the hazards of the restrictions, the interventions, and all these different things. But for many people, they just close their minds to it. We're doing it for the greater good, protect the NHS, save lives. This mantra that was drummed into people's minds meant that it was very difficult for them to go against that narrative. But the narrative is now dissolving. So is the tide turning? Well, yes, in a way, which is why I said yes and no at the beginning. The tide is turning because more and more people are recognizing that what we've been through the last couple of years is problematic. They're also recognizing that their lived experience, as in their day-to-day experience, particularly, I mean, this is where Omicron played a really pivotal role because, of course, the big old story of it being hyper-transmissible meant that a lot of people were positive with COVID over Christmas. And, people would talk to each other, wouldn't they, as they gathered amongst their families and said, did you actually get sick? No, just tested positive, nothing ever happened. Or, people talking about how mild it was, and it's not, I don't see what all the fuss is about. It's just like the common cold or the flu. And of course, I always feel like I need to put a disclaimer on there, caveat. Of course, some people are hit hard. This is what we've been banging on about for a long period of time. It's the human body. Each human body is unique. Each human body is nourished and taken care of in different ways. Some of us take better care of our bodies than others. Therefore, we become more prone to different ailments. So, of course, there's always exceptions. But we've got plenty of data that shows us quite clearly that this virus is largely severe for the number one factor is age. I mean, I always sense check. I always just fact check myself to make sure I'm talking sense. Look once again at the mortality data, and all the mortality data is very, very clear. Depending on what country you're looking at, the average age of mortality is usually in the 80s, early 80s. And actually the mortality curve largely follows the natural mortality curve. Meaning, if you take all-cause mortality and you map it out across the age range, you'll see that the COVID curve follows very normally alongside that natural mortality curve. So the idea that this whole existential threat to all of humanity is just not materialized. And when you look at the age-adjusted mortality rate versus the previous 20, 30, 40, 50 years, you can see it's a very small blip in the ocean. But then, of course, you get some people who still go, into, well, if we didn't lock down and we didn't do this and didn't do that, this and that, then, it would be much worse. And that's their mind. And they can't then look at the alternative where there's countries that haven't had stringent restrictions where they've actually performed better. But nonetheless, I did warn you this end up in a bit of a circular rant, but we've got this situation now where people are in their lived experience now speaking to friends, family, and recognizing that all of this fear that they've succumbed to, it doesn't actually match up to their reality. And that, when it combines with all of these different people now speaking out, these different stories reaching the media, the tide does begin to turn. Now, of course, I go back to the original point, how we talked about the notion of living with the virus. If you cast your mind back to 2021, and I was thinking out loud to my wife, you can imagine what my life is like, constant stream of consciousness. But reflecting on what was 2021. I mean, I don't know about you. I can't even remember 2021. It's like it's a non-event. It's like it wasn't a year. It didn't happen. I did have my first child, which is a major event, and I went to a number of protests. But other than that, and created hundreds of episodes of content. Didn't really have a life, other than working incredibly hard to try and make sense of this narrative and break it down, which, of course, is a noble effort. I wouldn't spend my time any other way, but I would have liked to have a few more holidays. My point is here that we, at the beginning of 2021, it was that irreversible roadmap out of lockdowns and how that we're going to begin to live with the virus. And then hocus pocus, here we are, later on in the year, things get madder and madder and crazier and crazier. So despite that intent at the beginning, we fell back on the old patterns. Now, there is a very real risk that that's going to happen again. The reality is we are dealing with here. If you follow the this is also where things get crazy because, I talked about some of the examples where some of the obvious, to me is obvious, the problems with the way that the pandemic was set up in terms of accounting for it. The way that we accounted for deaths and hospitalization was just insane. It's going to take decades to make any real sense of the actual burden of the disease, although you could probably just arbitrarily take Ferguson's models and divide them by somewhere between 10 and 100 and find that you've got a more realistic picture. In fact, if you looked at the ONS, the Freedom of Information request that was submitted to the ONS in the UK this week, that came back and showed that there's just been, and again, I use the word just lightly, but I'm just talking it here in terms of the context. Every death is, I understand, is someone's lost a family member, a loved one. I get that. I feel like I always have to caveat these things because, rather than listening to the point, people get into the emotions of it, which is natural. I understand if you've lost loved ones, my condolences. It's important that we have empathy. I'm a strong believer in that. But my point is this: the 17,000 deaths that have come back from the ONS, just over 17,000 deaths, is a reflection of how many people, according to the ONS, have died with COVID without any other comorbidities. So meaning this is potentially the sole cause of death. And I say potentially because, again, without prior investigation, without further validation, we can't really make sense of that. But you'll notice how 17,000 is significantly lower than the 150 odd thousand plus that the official register says for the number of deaths. But of course, that's in people's minds what shapes this idea that this is a existential deadly pandemic. So all of these things are starting to collapse. People's lived experience isn't matching up with what they've been told. 2 years on, they're starting to see that things don't add up. So the tide is turning, yes. But my point around living with the virus is we've been through this cycle again. And, I appreciate that there are some people out there that don't subscribe to germ theory or virology and take a different stance on the situation. But for the mainstream science looking at virology, what we know is that viruses will mutate. I mean, again, this was I did a critical piece on this when I first started to see that all of a sudden in 2021 or 2022, back in 2020, we started to see this hysteria about a new variant because, there's a couple of things that were peculiar about that. Firstly, of course, there was a new variant, and of course, there was mutations. And if anyone had been looking at the next strain data, you could see that the exact number of variations and mutations that had been occurring, according to the genomic sequencing at least. So it was very evident that this thing was moving. And why would you not expect that to occur? Because that, in the history of virology, is what always happens with viruses. They mutate and change. And it's almost like science forgot its own principles. Science forgot its own way. It forgot that this is how viruses work, at least, again, from a germ theory perspective. And again, appreciate some people don't resonate with that, but that's a whole different discussion and one that's quite fascinating to have. But nonetheless, that principle seemed to be forgotten. But secondly, the variant in question in 2020, the Delta variant, was discovered in September 2020, but they didn't make a fuss about it until November 2020, just as the Christmas period was coming into bear and winter was coming. So they kind of sat on the fear, and then all of a sudden blew the fear out of proportion. And the variants, if you notice, No one talked about the shift in the variant that happened back at the very beginning of the pandemic, during the March, April, where the variant that took hold of Europe was very different to the variant that was first discovered in Asia. No one even talked about it, as it was, it's the exact same thing. It's a seismic shift. It's a variation in, rather the phrase should have been, it's not a seismic shift. It's a shift in the way the virus is structured. This is what happens. To correct myself there. So so this is really key, because what could happen again, and what will happen again, is that we will see further shifts, mutations, and variations. Now, all it takes, as we know, is for the global community, whoever's behind that, the global scientific, pharmaceutical, industrial complex, to go, aha, here's a variation. What could we do with this variation? I mean, this is really skeptical corner, but if you just look at the timing of these variants and what has followed the timing of these variants, in the case of the winter variant this time around, the Omicron variant, we just saw this huge uptake in the third dose of the vaccine. Cha-ching, cash register, boom, boom. So it wouldn't be at all surprising to see another variant with additional hysteria, even though what we typically know about viruses is that they may become more transmissible, but they tend to become less severe. Now, of course, again, there are some anomalies in history where that's occurred, but it's very, 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 very rare. And what we've started to live by is this weird abstract theory that the worst case scenario is going to emerge, because that's how we've lived for the last 2 years. All the modeling has been based upon abstract worst case scenarios that almost had zero chance of ever materializing, and people just accepted it as face value. It's almost like it said in the small print, unlikely to occur, this is a worst case scenario, but everyone took it as gospel. And to me personally, you can't look at the track record of this these modeling departments and say that they've been anywhere reasonable. I mean, if any other industry you were woefully inadequate in your estimations so frequently, you'd be fired. But these people are revered and put on the forefront of policy and the forefront of newspaper articles that happen to be published at the timings of all these key events, which lead to further restrictions, mandates, or more vaccines. So I think there's a real possibility we could see a fallback position that comes from variants. Or maybe the world is getting bored. Maybe the sales targets have been achieved and it's time to move on. Now, back into skeptic corner, I do think what we will see, and mark my words on this, by the way, I will underscore this, because there have been several times throughout the pandemic where I've made assertions that, about the future. And I'm not Mystic Meg, I don't have a crystal ball, but you can start to see patterns quite clearly. And there is a pattern here, is that the pharmaceutical industry has done a pretty good job of convincing everyone they're at risk of this virus and therefore need to have not one vaccine, not two, not three, but four in some cases. And it won't stop there, will it? There's more. There's an NHS doctor came onto the television recently this week saying the more doses you have, the more protection you'll get. It's like, well, surely, mate, you're a sensible individual. You've been to medical school. You could surely start to consider the possibility that repeat doses of anything could have a negative impact on your overall immune system and your health. Surely that is just pure basic medicine. But no, no, line them up, get your loyalty card, keep on going. But one of the clear patterns within within this whole situation is you'll see the emphasis of the data. And this is classic marketing, by the way. If any of you are entrepreneurs or business leaders or work in marketing or advertising, you know full well that the way to drive sales is to clearly highlight a problem or pain, intensify that pain so people feel it personally and urgently, and therefore position your solution as the go-to most desirable solution to that urgent and immediate painful problem. So you'll notice that all of the data and all of the newspaper headlines are methodically around the world happen to coincide with the next phase of the vaccine rollouts. I mean, you could say I'm being a conspiracy theorist here, or it's just correlation, because everything always is just a correlation or a coincidence, isn't it, in this particular world? In itself, you have to, even if, I'd never really questioned vaccines up until 2020, not to this extent at least, always had a healthy skepticism. But when something gets dismissed as a coincidence over and over again, or a conspiracy or misinformation, when there's blatant evidence to the contrary, surely even the most uh, ignorant individual would see that there is something here that's not quite right. But nonetheless, we start to see all of these stories about the age groups. You start to see like, record numbers of young people hospitalized with COVID. That becomes the story, the dominant story that gets circulated, syndicated, and all of a sudden, boom, there you get the next approval from the JCVI, the MHRA, or whatever the regulatory body is in your country. All of a sudden, then approves the next vaccine for the next group of people, following that coordinated, in my view, media approach. So, whilst the tide is turning, I do think, and I've already seen some evidence of this in the last few days, we'll start to see the stories of the under fives, the under 12s, being adversely affected with hospitalization, with long COVID. All of these things will start doing the rounds, and it will lead to the next wave of approvals and rollouts of the vaccines. I really don't think that Pfizer will stop until they've gone all the way to at least 6 months plus, if not younger. I haven't checked recently around the trial data or the trial protocols that are currently running, but it would not surprise me one iota if they start looking at 0 to 6 months in their trials. It would not surprise me at all to see Pfizer looking in particular to look at profiting from every single age group. And I had I had an article that was fact checked for me using the phrase that the pharmaceutical companies want to vaccinate every living soul, and they said they fact checked that sentence. Well, I'm sorry, the evidence is contrary. The evidence is quite clear that the pharmaceutical industrial complex, it will not rest until they've attempted to vaccinate every living soul, including the youngest people on this planet, who quite clearly, from the evidence, are not seriously at scale impacted by COVID-19. And again, there's always, going back to the caveats, there's always exceptions. There's always these exceptions to the rule where young people may get sick, but that's always the case with every other type of illness. It's no different. But right now, this thing is going to end up on a subscription scheme. It's going to end up at every age group. Mark my words. But in order to make that happen, you need sufficient hysteria. So the tide may be turning, but it can't turn so far that it switches off the taps for the pharmaceutical industrial complex. So you have to be aware of that as a factor, because it's clearly playing a role. And if you don't believe that there are corporate interests that are playing out within this, I've lost for words. I'm lost for words. What we're witnessing, going back to the earlier points within this broadcast, harking back to the points around some of these points, this scientific revelation, where there is clear absurdities and clear malpractice and clearly, very, very flawed approaches to COVID-19. That can only have come from corporate science. No scientist worth their salt would have looked at any of the things that we're looking at in the last 20 months, 24 months, and within their professional expertise, agreed fully with every step of the way that this has gone, because it just doesn't make sense. I'm no scientist, and you say, well, who are you, Dan? You're an entrepreneur. What do you know about science? Well, I read thousands. I mean, I'm an intelligent person for a start. I do all right on the IQ scale. I studied economics and econometrics at university and advanced statistics. I have a way with numbers. But ultimately, I've surrounded myself with smart, intelligent people, and I've read thousands of articles to immerse myself in this, which is exactly what I would do with any business venture. I would immerse myself in the industry. I'd want to understand everything I possibly can. It's the way my team will tell you that. That's how my mind works. It wants to know everything. It's deeply curious. So whilst I'm not a scientist, I've surrounded myself with scientists. I've surrounded myself with medics and people who are smart enough to ask the types of questions that should be asked. So it is important that we recognize what has gone before us is not right. But to the point around the vaccinations, I've made that point. But then around that, we're still seeing this, what I call vaccine extremism around it. Despite all the evidence that is coming out around some of the risks, et cetera, we're seeing this push but more intensely, we're seeing the pursuit of vaccine mandates and the situation in Australia, the Djokovic situation. I mean, I had to screenshot the quote. It's just shocking. I mean, I'll pull it up now. I've hopefully got it immediately accessible. But just really, this one quote just summarizes how absurd the whole situation is. So the Australian government lawyer's main argument is that Djokovic may become an icon of free choice. Exact words used, an icon of free choice. My goodness, this is a reflection of the situation we find ourselves in, which when it comes to it, are we turning the tide? We have to recognize the ideological positions and the dogma that has underpinned a lot of what we've witnessed in the last 2 years has not gone away. In fact, it's amplified. In fact, the way in which the vaccination campaign has been pursued has been, quite frankly, insane to watch. The reality is, and if you look at the situation in France, where Macron was basically saying he's going to try and pee off its citizens who won't take the vaccine and make life very hard for them. I mean, think about it. If you're a parent, I'm a new parent, and you're worried about your child, would your goal become to aggressively make their life hell until they do what you say? That's not what a caring, in my view, it's not what a caring person does. Some obscure reality in someone's mind may think that being really harsh to people, being very authoritarian, and, without turning into a trauma counseling here and looking at the psychology of the situation, although we really, really should do that. If you actually look at, some of the background traumas that some of these world leaders have probably been through, and the kind of parenting styles that they've grown up with, they've probably grown up in authoritarian households where they didn't get the love they thought that they wanted from their specific family members. I'm freely associating and speculating, but there is psychology at play here, and nonetheless, we're not seeing the approach of someone who's genuinely caring and compassionate and looking out for the interests of their citizens, are we? Let's be quite frank about this. So we've seen this vaccine extremism that's resulted in these really intense mandates, and really one of the things that I think we must make the commitment as society, and the one I personally make a commitment myself, is I will not rest until these mandates cease. And the same with vaccine passports. I will not rest until they are over. I will not rest until they are gone. Many of us feel the same way. So it's important that we continue to resist and push back on these things. So whilst, yes, the tide is turning, in many ways, some of these government leaders, some of these world authorities are just warming up. Quite frankly, they're just warming up. And, it's COVID today, something else tomorrow. We're on a trajectory, quite frankly. And if you think this is all going to go away, well, it might do. I think the governments, the media, there'll be a very swift turn of affairs. I think it will very quickly disappear because, and the stories will start changing, because the reality is you cannot escape from the truths that will emerge. And in order to distract and to avoid that scrutiny, I'm sure there'll be a whole new narrative that suddenly emerges about something completely different, and people get on with their lives and it's all forgotten about. But some of us aren't willing to forget. Some of us aren't willing to do that. And it's really important that we not only push and resist against these lasting mandates, but in many ways seek retribution through accountability, through the courts, to make sure that this doesn't happen again. So whilst the tide may be turning, I hope that many of you, like myself, become so engaged in challenging these things. So we run the course to make sure we chase these mandates and restrictions down until there's none left. But then we also look at how we hold institutions and individuals to account. But more importantly, we build a better future, because quite frankly, like I said, the tide may be turning in one sense, but the energy, the kind of nihilism, that's the radicalist approaches that have underpinned what's gone on in the last 20 months is just the tip of the iceberg. The undercurrent that underpins it is intense. It may not affect all of us in our day-to-day life in the way that we've seen with COVID in particular, but mark my words, the industrial complex that's running behind this is just getting started. They're just warming up, and they've obviously recognized what's possible with the digital world that we live in, and how easy it is to captivate someone's attention focus, and how easy it is to drive compliance. So I think we do need to be very wary of any other growing narratives and any other trajectories, and there's more to come on that. But it's important that we don't just allow this to lie, because we must drive accountability and drive justice. But it's also important to continue to sense make some of the undercurrents that have underpinned this, to make sure that freedom in an open society becomes tantamount to the way that we live. That it's simply a way of life, and that we never have that threatened again in the way that we've seen, unless there was just cause. So time will tell. Is the tide turning? In one way, yes. In many other ways, not at all. This is not a time to back down. This is a time to regroup, refocus. And the good news is, yes, people are beginning to wake up. But secondly, people are becoming more organized. People are becoming more focused, and there is a legitimacy that is beginning to rise amongst the resistance, where we've perhaps previously not had that. It's been undermined by speculation or low quality arguments. Now the credibility and the legitimacy is really coming, and that's really going to add weight to what's going on now. And it's really important that we continue on that path. So for me personally, there's 4 areas I'm personally focused on: resistance against these mandates and restrictions. Number 2 is recovery, helping people to mentally, emotionally, physically, financially recover from the response to the pandemic. There's lots of healing required out there and self-care. Number 3 is retribution, looking at justice and accountability through the courts on a domestic and international scale. And then number 4, importantly, is rebuilding and reimagining the world that we see, and seeking to develop a world that is free and open for all, and built upon more human values of compassion, participation, vitality, love, kindness, and really important that we start to look at the very foundation and the very fabric of the social contract and how we move forward as a world. Because the most frightening, I think, is the undercurrents that underpin this, and how that could affect the long-term future, the long-term trajectory. It's really important that we start to turn the tide in a very different direction. And it's important to recognize that we all have a role to play, and the system has been set up for us to feel like we are minions in the master plan. Well, the reality is, if that's what you think, that's what you'll get. But for those of you who have a sense of empowerment, and those of you who have a sense of duty, those who have a sense of leadership and want to play a part in changing the world, well, the world is our oyster right now, and there is a great opportunity for us to really lay the groundwork for a much better world for not only the planet we live in and all its inhabitants, but for our children and our children's children. And it's down to us. It's down to us to create that change. Now, if you want to be part of that change, here's my pitch. We are about to launch in the next 10 days the Elevate Network, which is a online community designed to address these 4 R's that I've shared with you tonight: resistance, recovery, rebuilding, and of course, recourse to legal, I've lost the 4th R now, retribution, to talk about how we hold these individuals accountable, but really focus on elevating humanity. It's why it's called the Elevate Network. Elevating humanity, bringing about the global awakening, and creating social transformation in a very peaceful, loving vibration that we kind of want to bring into the new phase of the world that we live in. Because the energy that's dominated for the last couple of years has been dark, fear-based, scarcity-based, where it's time to live out of love, abundance, and caring, and kindness and compassion. And in shifting the energy, we shift the way that we act, and the way we feel, and the way that we get results. So we're creating a space for people to talk about and contribute to how we make that better future, how we elevate humanity and enrich the world around us, how we can consciously create a better future. So if that sounds like the kind of community you'd like to be part of, please join our mailing list if you haven't done so already. Just go to danjgregory.com/pandemic. That's danjgregory.com/pandemic. We will have a new website address very soon to follow that. But if you join the mailing list, you will be kept right up to date with our latest developments on the community network, which we're very, very excited to bring to you. It's going to be a very empowering and uplifting and inspiring place. Yes, there's going to be a place for us to talk about the absurdities of the world, but this is really about creating a space that is transcendent of the situation we find ourselves in. It's a place that calls you to your higher self, calls you to show up as the leader you want to be, in order that you can create a ripple effect in your own lives and the lives around you, so that together that we can create a ripple in the world that creates a wave and really brings about the kind of change that we wish to see. So please do join our mailing list. You'll be the first to hear about our brand new community. and how you can play your part. Anyway, is the tide turning? Maybe, maybe not. Who knows? But the ultimate message is when enough of us come together with the human spirit of creativity, and we put our minds together to create a better world, you know what happens? We create that ripple, we create a wave, and then, my goodness, the tide certainly begins to turn. All right. Good night for now. I will see you again later this week. Thanks for tuning in. Peace and love.